WAS. An exciting day that we've got ahead of you with Chris Mitchell this morning and Dean Beadle this afternoon. I've just got to offer apologies from Diane and Jane, who've been held up with work and won't be able to make appointments. So apologies to you, Chris, and Diane, our Chief Executive, and the Client Services not making it. But they said they're sure it's going to be a very interesting day, and they will see your video later. It should be very good. Chris is going to talk to us in the morning, as you see up here, about the mindful living with Asperger syndrome. Yvonne and Michelle and I had the pleasure of dining with Chris last night and had a very enjoyable evening, and he's absolutely fascinating, so I'm sure you're going to enjoy the morning. Okay, so can you welcome Chris, please? He's going to talk to us this morning.
Well, thank you very much, and also thanks very much to Elaine and to Michelle for their wonderful hospitality last night. It's made me feel so nice and calm and very enthusiastic about coming to meet you all this morning. Okay, what I'd like to start with is what's going to be very much the theme of this talk, which is the continual now of living with Asperger's syndrome. It's almost symbolised by the image in the first slide, which is a freshly carved piece of ice from an active glacier. Very, very blue, because blue's the only colour on the spectrum not absorbed by the ice itself. It's only in that shape for a small period of time before it actually melts, but that's part of its existence, from being part of the glacier to being a floating berg of ice, and then to water, and then maybe eventually to mist. But it all exists in a continual now, rather than each stage happening separately. And Asperger's syndrome similarly exists throughout your life in a continual now, including if you've been diagnosed late in life. It's present in your life in your years before diagnosis, but you become more aware of it after you receive the piece of paper that says you have Asperger's syndrome. And in that way, and then it continues with you throughout your life. What? Just a little bit about me before we go into Asperger's syndrome and what it's like to be a person with Asperger's syndrome. So I got my diagnosis when I was 20 years old. That was when I was still a university student after a period of depression. And I'm now 35, and since my diagnosis I've gone on to obtain an MA in information management, and in September 2010 I was appointed to the position of operational manager at Autism Works. Autism Works is a social enterprise that's a trading subsidiary of Education and Services for People with Autism. That's a similar service to the Wirral Autistic Society based up in Sunderland. Autism Works offers employment to people on the autistic spectrum in the field of software testing. It's actually based on a model already in existence called Specialist Firm, who are based in Denmark. And in my spare time, I practice mindfulness to help cope with the ups and downs of Asperger's syndrome, and aside from working at Autism Works, I also give a lot of training on Asperger's syndrome, including what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is mindfulness and Asperger's syndrome, including some mindfulness techniques. And there are some opportunities a little bit later to actually participate in some very simple mindfulness exercises if you're interested. But before we go into that, what I like to do when I give training on autism and Asperger's syndrome is I like to give the audience an idea of how it might actually feel to be a person on the autistic spectrum, or a person with Asperger's syndrome. And for this part, I'll need a couple of volunteers. One of you already has offered. So come out here, Jamie, please. Okay, and I need one more. Is anybody brave enough? Come on,
oh,
then.
No, it can't be you, Yvonne. Go on then, all right.
All right, surprise. Jamie, what I would like you to do first of all is to imagine what you've got in front of you that's on the slide, which is to imagine that you've just landed on another planet. Now, you've not met anybody yet who lives on this other planet, so you don't know the customs of the local people, the verbal customs and the non-verbal customs, or how they interact. But you're an explorer, and you're very curious to know all about the local people. And Emma is the first person that you've met on this strange other planet. Now, what I would like you to do, Jamie, this is the first object that you've found and picked up. You're an explorer, and you're curious to know what it actually is, but you can't speak the local language, so you can't speak any English or any other known human dialects. But you want to find out what that particular object is. And now, you can use language because you're from Earth, but you can't because you're from another planet. Imagining you're from another planet. And by not using any language, I want to see if you can find out what that object is by asking the first living being you've come into contact with.
Right. Wow.
Oh yes. I think that's it. Don't do it. So I throw it, and off it goes. Well, what's this?
Right. Now, how do you find not being able to use any language?
Well, it's very confusing. It's useful to have the gestures and to have the visual stuff, but the language didn't really make sense.
Right, so it's a big step outside your comfort zone. And how do you find explaining to somebody who can't understand language?
Well, I suppose, it doesn't hurt to use a bit of language, but, it's really helpful to be able to sort of be quite dramatic in the way you're presenting it, like visually,
Right, because it can sometimes be frustrating when you're trying to get something across but somebody can't understand it. And that can also lead to a lot of anxiety, which comes from the confusion. And this is very much how a person on the autistic spectrum or with Asperger's syndrome can sometimes feel like in normal situations. Okay, thanks very much for that. You can sit down now. Thank you. So, one of the easiest ways to imagine what it's perhaps like to be a person with Asperger's syndrome is to imagine that you've just landed on another planet. And similarly, even on your own planet, where there are different civilizations, different peoples who speak different languages, you may well have experienced this when you've been on holiday to a foreign country where the first language isn't English, and in addition to that, many of the local people speak very little, if any, of your language, so you can't ask anybody for directions. You can't ask anybody where your hotel is or how to get to the airport. And this is going to lead to a lot of anxiety. And something that many people with Asperger's syndrome have issues with is being able to understand or read non-verbal communication, including being aware of their own non-verbal presentation. As a species, much of our communication, in fact, I'm told over 80% of our communication as a species is actually non-verbal rather than spoken. So basically, for a person with Asperger's syndrome, ordinary situations, not necessarily going to a foreign country or even visiting another planet, can feel very like this. And I just have to use my favourite analogy, which is that of a Vietnamese motorcycle rider coming to visit the Wirral, where There's a lot of traffic laws that they're not familiar with, a lot of road rules that they're not familiar with back in Saigon, where in the Wirral and throughout much of the Western world, you're used to stopping at red lights or at pelican crossings, allowing passengers to cross, pedestrians to cross. But if you're a pedestrian in Saigon and you wait for the traffic to stop, you'll be waiting all day because the motorcycle riders don't stop. So the way to cross the road, rather than waiting for the traffic to stop, is to walk into the traffic, and the motorcycle riders swerve around you. Social and emotional imbalance and Asperger's syndrome. A conversation I've just had with one or two of you about the triad of impairments having to have been updated in the last few years so that it's lack of social imagination rather than lack of imagination. So whereas many people not on the autistic spectrum learn a lot of social and emotional skills, being able to recognise, understand, and in some cases almost have a feeling for the emotions of other people. Whereas this comes intuitively. People with Asperger's syndrome, something that I found certainly within my own life, often have to learn this through observation and practice, almost like you're being an actor. And a character popular with many adults with Asperger's syndrome who also has this difficulty is Mr. Spock. To be able to interact among humans, Mr. Spock has to spend a lot of his time learning a lot of different social skills and different social conventions to be able to interact with many of his human colleagues, but it leaves a little bit less scope for him to learn all about emotions and the heart. I'm going to talk a little bit, just before we go into a bit more depth of how it feels to be a person with Asperger's syndrome, including sometimes how it feels to be me personally. How is Asperger's syndrome diagnosis and what it feels like? It's something very similar. As I mentioned right at the start, like with Asperger's syndrome's continual now. So an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis, or at the point of it, is almost like why mountains have base camps. The base camp allows mountaineers to take a much needed break before moving on to the next part of their challenge, which is the push to the summit, being able to look at what they've done well, what they've coped well with, and look at what they've struggled with to help them prepare for that next stage of their life, the push to the summit. And similarly, an Asperger's syndrome diagnosis allows you to gain a stronger understanding of yourself, something that it gave me an opportunity to do for the first time in my life, I felt, was to be able to almost make a self-assessment of myself, understanding the strengths and weaknesses and also who I generally was as a person. So knowing that it was going to be present with me through the rest of my life. Now, Asperger's syndrome, the diagnosis, is almost like a three-pointed jewel, which, as well as having a lot of qualities, can also have sometimes a lot of stresses. At the point of diagnosis, one of the first things I felt was relief, because it gave me an explanation for why I was the way I was and why my life had been the way it had been. But sometimes it can also bring a feeling of regret. In my case, I felt some regret for what I felt I'd missed out on in the past. For instance, there was a lot of things during my mid to late teens most of us go through, including a period of social and emotional maturation, which I feel as though I didn't go through and learned a little bit later. And ultimately, and I'm going to go over couple of exercises later to help cope with this particular aspect of it, which is the doubt, where a lot of stress comes over because it's something that hasn't happened yet. It's how your diagnosis is going to affect you in your future, both immediate and long term, including situations in your life that you're perhaps yet to experience. Now I'm going to go into mindfulness before I relate it to to Asperger's syndrome and the effects of Asperger's syndrome, just to explain a little bit about what it is. Put very simply, mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment, where we are, right here and now, being with the present moment. So we often find ourselves thinking about times in our past or what we're going to do in the future, including what we're going to do tomorrow, or even what we're going to do in the next couple of hours or so. I've already said one or two things about what you might be able to expect in the next couple of hours, but for the purpose of what we're doing, we'll stay with each moment as it unfolds, or at least try to. Simply paying attention to the present here and now. And so that people don't get the wrong impression of mindfulness, what it isn't. It's not a cure for Asperger's syndrome. I mean, different people on the autistic spectrum are very different and have different opinions all about whether or not they would accept a cure for Asperger's syndrome. There are some who perhaps would, and some, including myself, who wouldn't, because we might feel as though it's a part or even a characteristic of who we are as an individual. Or in my case, it's because I feel it's the way I am, as I am naturally. And what it isn't, and this is sometimes a bit of a detraction from mindfulness practice, it isn't conversion to Buddhism or any other related faiths, including Hinduism, by the back door. So I have known it to happen in some schools with the Mindfulness in Schools program, where when mindfulness practices have been introduced in faith-based schools, sometimes parents think it's conversion to Buddhism, but the practice doesn't necessarily have to be. And although mindfulness practice, particularly meditation, does have its roots in Buddhism and in Hinduism, the actual practice of it doesn't have to be based around a particular faith. Because sometimes when it is based around a faith, it becomes almost a doctrine or a very rigid way of life, which can mean a lot of inflexibility. So one of the purposes of mindfulness, and one of the key factors about the practice is, which we'll go into more later, particularly in the second half of the presentation, is the flexibility and adaptability of it.